Greetings, traveler. I'm SnapJelly. My shirt is darker on the inside than it is on the outside, and that is not a segue into this video, it's just a fact. Today, I wanted to talk about spikes. Yes, and particularly spikes on equipment that people potentially have in fantasy or any weapon or armor design that you might come up with. Yeah, spikes are not as useful as people tend to think, and that's kind of what I want to say in this hopefully very short video, and that is because I make a lot of videos about armor, particularly fantasy armor, and there's always people going on, but what if you add spikes to it? Well, spikes they didn't happen all that much because there are various kinds of all kinds of things in history that had spikes. But you know, it's not really the norm to add spikes, and it's because spikes are bothersome in many ways. Just think about like a morning star mace and a flanked mace, right? The morning star mace has pointy things, looks very intimidating, but the flanked maces were vastly more popular simply because, well, most of the time your mace is going to be dangling around your hip, and you don't want spiky things to be dangling around your hip because you might hurt yourself. That's one reason. Also, another thing that you have to keep in mind is that if something is pointy, it's very thin, you know. If the spikier a spike is, the thinner it gets, and the more likely it is to bend, and if it's bent, then you can't use it anymore. That and a Morningstar mace and a flank mace do relatively the same amount of damage, so do you really need the spikes? Another example would be, like a couple days ago I made a video talking about potential equipment for giants to use, right? And I said that if a giant were to fight a human, it would be very beneficial for him to have shoes that have metal toes parts. What's that called? Noses? I forgot. Anyway, so he could kick him, right? Depending on how tall the giant is, of course, but he could just kick the humans away. Now, I had at least half a dozen people say, well, what if you add spikes to the boots? Well, that looks great and all, but first off, if you kick a human with spikes on your boots, then well, what's going to happen is that human is going to get stuck. If it's not the first one, it's going to be the second one or the third one or whatever. There is at some point going to be a human stuck to your foot. And then you have a dead human flopping around on your foot, and you don't want that. Second thing you have to keep in mind is, does the spike actually do more damage? Because think about it, if you're fighting a human that's potentially very small, if you're a giant, right, and you kick him, well, the spike is just going to go straight through his body, and yeah, he's pretty much dead. But if you don't have that spike, you would kick him, you would still lift him off his feet again, depending on how big you are, of course. But you would still lift him off his feet and break his bones and smush multiple organs and give him a huge concussion, and he's incapacitated anyway. He's most likely going to die of his wounds. So, do you really need the spike? No. And if the human is armored, then you might say, oh, well, a spike might pierce the armor. But no, again, it won't, because the armor of the human is still incredibly strong. Right? It doesn't matter how strong you are compared to the human. What's going to happen is if the iron and the iron meet each other, the weakest one of the two is just going to fly off his feet. That's what's going to happen. If you're fighting a human that's armored and you have a spike on your boot and you kick him, he's just going to fly away, not having his armor pierced. The same as what's going to happen if you don't have the spike on your boot. Unless the human is pressed up against something, like the ground or something, and you kick him, then you might pierce the armor. But on the other hand, if you don't have the spike, you're just going to probably just crush him completely. So, again, you don't need the spike. That, and considering that having a spike on your foot is just probably very uncomfortable. Just think about you walking through the woods or something, and you come across a tree that has like roots that extend a little bit above the ground, and your spike gets stuck on that, and you boom, fall flat on your face. You can't have that on the battlefield, or maybe it gets stuck behind a rock or something. And, well, after you get up, they better hope that as that spike gets stuck behind whatever it gets stuck on, that it doesn't bend downwards a little bit, because then you can't walk anymore, because the spike is going to be awkwardly sticking into the ground. Oh, that's great and all, you can't use it anymore, you can't even walk anymore. So, point is, the spike isn't really very beneficial. And two other things that I have people suggest to me in the past is, one is gauntlets with spikes, and I believe that I have seen those somewhere, but I can't really remember where, but they may have existed, but they weren't very common. And another one is somebody actually suggested that armor would have a spike on the elbow, so you could give elbow bashes. Now thinking about the gauntlets first, right? Technically, yes. I mean, the idea is very simple. If you have spikes on your knuckles, like Wolverine claws, right, you could just punch people with that, but keep this in mind. A gauntlet is already a weapon if you think about it. If your opponent is unarmored and you deck him in the face, then yeah, that's gonna hurt a lot. You're gonna have to finish him off, but here's the thing, most likely if you do have spikes, you're still gonna have to finish him off afterwards. Because if those spikes are incredibly long, that's gonna be very bothersome. So if you want them to be comfortable for you to use normally, then the spikes are not gonna be as big. So you'll most likely won't kill him with the first strike. It would do technically more damage than an ordinary punch with a gauntlet, but in either case he's just gonna be incapacitated and you have to finish him off some other way. So no real benefit to the spikes. If your opponent is wearing a helmet, however, then, well, neither a punch with a gauntlet, normal gauntlet, or with the spikes are going to do anything, and the spikes are just going to bend on impact, so then they're useless. Once more, they don't do anything. That and the spikes might simply get stuck in your cape or your clothes or whatever the heck. They might be bothersome when you're trying to fight normally. Holding a shield may be difficult if you have spikes on your knuckles, so yeah, all kinds of problems. Now with the elbow one, that one, it sounds very cool because, of course, like a movie scenario, you're getting close and you throw an elbow bash and boom, it has a spike there. Oh, he spears through, blood everywhere. Cool. But in the off chance that you get to perform an elbow bash during a fight, like, I mean, you could. I did it once in my fighting career. During a shield wall, I got very close up to my enemy and I did an elbow bash to his shield, I might add, to kind of just push him away, and that worked. Once I did an elbow bash, but yeah, technically, like, is that worth it? Keep that in mind, because you know you have a spike somewhere extending from your elbow that you are gonna have to walk around with the entire day. Just in that slight chance that you get to perform an elbow bash on somebody who is again not armored, because if he is armored, you're not gonna be able to pierce that armor. So it needs to be an unarmored opponent that assaults you in such a way that you get in perfect position to perform an elbow bash with that spike, and boom, then you pierce them, and that's why you have that spike. How often is that going to happen? And even if it does happen, if you do not have the spike, that elbow bash, because for this I'm just considering you're completely armored, right? Because if you have armor like on your arms like that, you're most likely in full suit of armor. So if you perform a normal elbow bash without the spike, but just being armored here, that is still going to break his ribs. So it's already doing a lot of damage. It may not pierce his body, but still it's very effective. You could just go like bam and then finish him off with your weapon. So do you need the spike? If he's unarmored, in either case it's just going to do an insane amount of damage, and if he is armored, then it's going to do fairly little damage in either case. Well, maybe if he has mail, it could be beneficial because the spike might pierce the mail, but again, if you don't have the spike, it will not pierce him, but it would still break his bones. So which one is more beneficial? You're making yourself wider, essentially, because that spike, it can also hurt your allies, right? If you're fighting in a line and you have a spike extending somewhere here, then the person next to you is going to be in immediate danger, and that's supposedly an ally. That's not very helpful. And also, something that you have to keep in mind, like there's tons of accounts of people being disarmed because their opponents fall to the floor after they're stabbed. So they'll stab their opponent and they fall and their sword is still inside their body. So they take their sword with them as they fall. Now imagine that happening with your elbow. Right, somebody assaults you, you go wham! And then that guy, maybe just because of the bash or maybe he dies instantly, he falls to the floor and you're still stuck inside him. So now you have a guy dangling on your elbow who is now dead. Oh, that's a great scenario to be in. I would prefer to just give him an elbow bash. Maybe not kill him, but break several of his bones and just have him lie there. What do I care? So, why the spike? It looks very cool. The idea is very cool, but it's not very useful. Spikes are very difficult. They are annoying. They are dangerous. But you've got to keep in mind when you think of armor and equipment and weapons and things like that. Most of the time, it's going to be around the person who would use it to defeat his opponent. Right? And if it's something that he has to actively keep around him or wear or carry or something like that, then those spikes are going to bother him more than they are going to bother his opponent. Now, if it's armor specifically made for duel or something, then I don't really have anything to say. Make yourself pointy all the way. Pincushion attack. Just hug your opponent to death. I don't care. If there's one opponent and nothing else you have to worry about, you just get dressed, you do that one fight, and then you take the armor off. Great, just have spikes everywhere. I don't care, I don't really see any downsides that way. But yeah, you gotta think of the bigger picture. Like, just common usage, that's one. And two is protecting your allies and yourself. The spikes are gonna bother everyone around you and yourself many times. So, that's it. Spikes can be very useful if you can control them, like a single spike on a Warhammer. It's devastating, it's very powerful. But yeah, just putting spikes on everything, it's most likely gonna get stuck on everything, and you don't want that. So, that's all I wanted to say. I'm gonna go because I need to take a piss. And lastly, I want to say is that I still get comments occasionally of people saying that YouTube automatically unsubscribed them. So I would recommend you to follow your favorite YouTubers on social media as a reminder that they're still alive. So there you go. If YouTube decides to unsubscribe you from anybody, you'll know that most YouTubers post online that they uploaded and stuff like that. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you for joining my quest, and hope you'll join me in the next one. Bye bye. It was the weirdest outro ever.